Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Cheryl, for hosting this event tonight in this extraordinary museum. On behalf of everyone at the Atlantic, I add my welcome to all of you tonight. Thank you for being here. I'd like to say just a few words about our speakers. Ta-Nehisi's new book, as you heard, is a compilation of stories he wrote for the Atlantic over an 8-year period, with new essays preceding and framing each of the stories. I met Ta-Nehisi when I arrived at the Atlantic as the editor of Digital after he had published just the first of these pieces. This was back in 2009, and that story was on Bill Cosby. In those days, Ta-Nehisi was not yet a best-selling author, not a National Magazine Award winner, not a regular guest on late-night comedy shows, and not, as the MacArthur Foundation would dub him, a genius, at least not with a capital G. All that came later. He was, as you learn in the first essay, applying for unemployment benefits just a year earlier. He'd been thinking he might leave writing and maybe drive a cab or 10 bar in order to provide for his family. And he made his mark in those days not simply or even principally as a writer of long magazine stories and essays. Ta-Nehisi was, to use an archaic term, a blogger, and he was among the best. Before long, he was taking time away from the blog to work on these deeply reported stories and essays that make up the book. Throughout all of this, on the blog, in the magazine stories, in his books, Ta-Nehisi's relied on his own curiosity to drive his work. Whether he's researching the Civil War or questioning criminal justice practices or exploring the role of gaming, hip-hop, and football in our culture, Ta-Nehisi succeeded by following his reporting instincts. He'd be the first to tell you he'd rather ask questions than answer them. 60 years ago, on the 100th anniversary of the Atlantic, editor Edward Weeks said the purpose of the Atlantic was to make thinking people think harder. Nobody does that better than Ta-Nehisi. So he's here tonight, yes, answering questions, in conversation with someone you all know, Michele Norris. An award-winning newspaper and broadcast journalist, Michele was, for a decade, the host of NPR's All Things Considered. More recently, she's the creator of the brilliant Race Card Project, which explores the role of race through 6-word submissions from tens of thousands of Americans. I think you all have cards in your packets so you can contribute as well. Michele is also a great friend to the Atlantic, and so it's my pleasure to welcome Michele Norris and Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Introduction. It's really wonderful to be here in this sacred space. And if you've visited this museum, you see Mr. T on the walls here in the museum. He has come to be that for this generation, helping us understand the moment that we're living in and also helping us look back at history with courage, because when you read these essays, you're writing about America right now, but it very much is a history lesson as well. So I just want a simple question. You just dropped a big book. Can you hear? Okay, let's try again. I want to begin with this, a simple question. You've just dropped a big book. You've been on tour. How are you doing right now?
Can you guys can hear me now, right? Okay, all right, that's good. I love tour. Who doesn't love tour? Where's Greg? Right, Greg? I love tour, don't I? I adore being on tour. It's the funniest thing, and I go through this in the book. This is like I'm in my 21st year since I started as a professional writer, and for most of that year, for most of that time, for most of those years, the problem was getting someone to pay attention to you. I spent, just a good bit of, my career, just writing, for the sheer joy and the sheer curiosity. And most writers, in order to continue, they prepare themselves not to be heard. And then really with the publication of, I guess, The Case for Reparations and between the world and me. I've spent every year since then trying to prepare for the fact of being heard. I know it's rich people's problems, but it's problems nonetheless.
A good problem to have.
A good problem to have. I would not go back. I would not. Let's be clear. I would not go back. But nonetheless, it's a transition. I'm doing well. I'm certainly doing better than where I was, where this book starts off. So I'm frankly just happy, pleased that, all of you guys in this audience, have taken an interest in the book and taken an interest in the work and are here to talk about it.
So when you were writing these essays, this is a compilation of essays during the 8 years that Barack Obama lived just a few blocks away. And there are tick-tock of essays. Some of them deal directly with the Obama presidency and the political moment. Some, as Bob mentioned, were about Bill Cosby. There's essays that don't deal directly with the presidency. But at some point when you were writing these pieces, did you get the sense that you were actually putting together the bricks that would build a house that would become a book?
Really, really late. I think after the case for reparations came out, it was then suggested to me that you might want to compile, this body of work into something. I didn't really know what that was, and even when I signed the contract for the book with my publisher, the idea was just I didn't know what was going to be in it. The idea was to compile, some of the stuff I had written for the Atlantic, and my thinking, I started to do that, and I started to go through that. I had a young lady who works for the publisher. She printed out all of the blogging I'd done, everything, Bob. It was from beginning to end, and boxes were delivered to my house. It's funny, to read all your blogging on paper. But I went through it, and it became clear that to me that I thought there might be something more there than just compiling a bunch of essays together. And so with that in mind, we began to pick specific essays that, we thought could actually tell a story. And then there was a memoir that we tried to drive through the whole thing.
How did you choose the 8? How did you land on these final 8?
I guess in my mind, or not even in my mind, in my heart, emotionally, I felt like there were connections. Every one of those that I picked represents a really important moment. The second one, about the First Lady, Michele Obama, which I don't think is one of the better essays in the book. I think the writing... American Girl, yeah. I think the writing gets a lot better as it goes across. And I wanted you guys... there are two ways writers do this. One way they do it is to show off and say, here's how great I am. But I've always been more interested in process. So I think the actual stories tell a story. You know what I mean? I think you can see the thinking getting better, the writing getting better. I think, all of that coming together. But at the same time, that second essay, I had memories attached to, really strong memories. I had this memory of, me just beginning to work with the Atlantic, and which would prove to be a momentous thing in my life, but still feeling I don't know if this is going to work. I had this memory of being, as I write about, at the Aspen Ideas Festival. And my wife, it's funny now, it wasn't funny at the time. My wife's employer calling her and telling her job was gone while we're in the middle of idyllic Aspen. And I remembered that, you know what I mean? And that was at the same place where I got the assignment to write that piece. And I remember being so excited about, the fact that I had another assignment for the Atlantic. And I remembered going out to Stanford and us getting the check for the fellowship. And Wachovia, where we had the account at the time, the check being drawn Wachovia and depositing the check. And, the amount of money being larger than anything that had ever been in our bank account, ever. That we could ever dream about being in our bank account.
That's a good feeling.
Yeah, and how we went to the steakhouse right across the street and got silly drunk and ate everything. Bring me everything. So I had that strong memory of that. You know what I mean? So in that sense, it wasn't even that, I felt the essay was the strongest essay. But the story behind it was just so, important to me.
When you're writing... As a journalist, you're writing the first draft of history. I mean, we don't often think of it that way, but we really are. And years from now, people will look to these stories to help understand the moment that we're living in, which is momentous for so many reasons, not just because a black family lived in the White House, but because we're turning a page demographically in the country because of technological changes and economic tumult and all kinds of things. But when you were writing these, you've now gone back and repackaged these in this tome. Which of the essays held up and which didn't? Because you were kind of writing...
Yeah, a lot of them did not hold up. The Bill Cosby essay doesn't hold up particularly well. The American Girl essay, as I mentioned, does not hold up particularly well. I think the next essay is the Malcolm X one, which is okay. Once I got to like the 4th out of 8, it started to get better. I think the Civil War one holds up pretty well. I think everything after that, I stand behind. I want you to understand something, though. This is not like a lack of confidence or me, taking shots at myself. I think like one of the, reasons why I always shrink back from the title, public intellectual, or some of the other things that people put on me is where people really are looking is for like prophecy. They want people who say things that are automatically right, that name things about the world. And for me, the best thing about the process of journalism, about reporting and writing, is those essays don't have to hold up. That was where I was at that point in time. I have the right to grow. I have the right to change. I have the right to get better. I have the right to look back on it and say, I was right about this. I was right about, I was wrong about that. And a lot of folks just want to be right. They just want to be right. You know what I mean? It's like, everything I say, and their whole authority is in being right. And I have always felt like my authority is in being honest. I'll be straight with you. It don't mean I'm going to be right, but I will be straight with you.
And things evolve.
And things evolve. And things evolve. And you change. You know what I mean? And if you're not changing, I don't know, like you're missing out on half the fun of being a reporter. You know what I mean? You're not growing. You're not, there has to be some sort of selfish aspect of it that goes beyond just preaching to people and just telling people and watching them nod their heads as you say something. It has to be something internal, something you're learning, some sort of, joy that you're deriving for yourself in your private space.
Do you feel in some way, because you write about the things that people have a hard time facing, let alone talking about, that people are often looking to you for something, that they're looking to you for answers? And does that feel like an opportunity or a burden to you?
Yeah, a lot. Opportunity or burden. Well, I don't enjoy it. I'm of like two minds of it. My initial impulse, my inside, just my private Ta-Nehisi coach impulse is, what are you asking me for? Like that's my initial, why would you ask me? I gave you what I knew and that was it. You know what I mean? My expectation is, that's what I got. You know what I mean? I don't, because I think like, again, like the journalistic perspective, the process is different than I think like an academic or even a pundit. When you go to do a story, you have to become dumb again every time. It's different because the person you're talking to always knows more than you about whatever you're talking about. So you're repeatedly going through this process of people going to school on you. And I know the reader doesn't see that. The reader sees the finished process. And so to the reader, you look like an expert. But in your mind, what you remember is everything that led up to that finished process. That's who you are, because that's the thing that you spend the majority of your time with. And so I find it very difficult to, change roles and then say, well, here I have answers as opposed to questions. The flip side of that, though, is I think to some extent at least, even as I'm as uncomfortable as I am saying this, to some extent one should embrace the opportunity. Because there are people out there who genuinely want to know. And the fact is, if you spent, large amounts of time researching, reporting something, you probably know something that they don't. And so as you can tell, I don't always like it, but I'm trying to increasingly embrace the opportunity.
Is there in some ways, are you concerned that people look at your work as a proxy? He talks about race, so I don't have to. He talks about these issues, so I don't have to.
Well, even more so, Michelle's like, he thought about this, so now I don't have to think about it. Mm-hmm. Well, he said X, Y, and Z. I don't have to, it's like, don't outsource your critical thinking to me. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what I'm here for. I'm not like anybody's Bible. Again, that's why the book is done the way it's done. This is not a Bible. This is not to be cited from and, Ta-Nehisi thought this, so therefore. I mean, if you find something that speaks to you, I'm not speaking out against that. But I think there's one of the things that happened that made me realize that things had changed quite a bit was in the 2016 primary, I went on a show to talk about something. I went on Democracy Now! To talk about something. And the journalist, being a really good journalist, asked me who I was voting for. I answered that question directly. And it turned into an endorsement. Like, it turned into, this is who I should vote for. And I'm like, no, what are you listening to me for, man? You know what I'm saying? Like, I went through my process, and I think this is, like, the best decision, as far as I know. But, you may know something else. I'm not an authority here. You know what I mean? I'm not, a wise man, with the long gray beard standing on high saying, go in this direction. This is just what I think. And so I hope people read, and I hope they derive inspiration. I hope they derive insight. But I really fear the notion of the conversation ending with me. It should be an invitation to go have other conversations.
The beginning point.
The beginning point, yeah.
So you don't want people to outsource your critical thinking to you, but let's dig into some of that critical thinking. In the first essay, you talk about the notion of good Negro government, and it's interesting because there's a comment that's made by, I believe it's from Georgia, Howell Cobb, and there's a statement that is deep because it talks about the moment, but it also talks very much about this moment that we're living in. And he says, excuse me, he says, the day you make a soldier of them is the beginning of the end of our revolution. The day you make a soldier of them is the beginning of the end of our revolution. There's a conundrum in that, and I want you to put that in context for the time in which that statement was made.
That's a great question.
And then what it means in relation to the election of Barack Obama, the notion of a black family moving into the White House in this America.
Michele's a great journalist. I just want to. I was upstairs. I was joking because she came in. She said, "Oh, how's it going? You've done several of these. How the talks going?" I said, "They're starting to run together." I have not gotten that question, and it's a great opportunity to talk about something that's really, I think, important. It at least struck me in a particular way. That comment was made by Howell Cobb, who was a Confederate. He was an official in the Confederate government at the time, and I believe it was made in early 1865 during the Civil War. Things are going really badly for the Confederacy, and one of the reasons why they're going badly is because the Union has enlisted somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 African Americans to go fight for them, and that turns what was thought to be a Confederate advantage, that is the fact of having enslaved black people who could work at home and could do, all of this drudgery, keep the army fed, actually into an advantage for the Union, because those folks are now, leaving plantations, leaving Confederate lines and going to actually fight in the Union Army. So it takes away from the Confederate Army and actually bolsters the Union Army. One of the entire theories of enslavement held that black people weren't brave, black people wouldn't fight, and particularly black men. All of this is caught up in notions of masculinity. It's a very, very gendered concept. But the idea that black men couldn't be soldiers, they couldn't fight, they didn't possess the virtue, to be daring. And now these Confederate soldiers are fighting against actual black people who are, proving that clearly they do. So, some of the Confederate officials and generals get the idea, well, why don't we get our own, Negroes, as they would say, to fight for us? It was an insane idea, but, that was the idea. The idea to get black people to fight, right, for them. And this actually goes back and forth to the point that General, Lee actually, approves the idea. And some of the Confederates are vehemently opposed to it. One of them, Howell Cobb, and Cobb says, if slaves can be good soldiers, then our whole theory of slavery is wrong. And then he leads into that other part. The moment you make soldiers, the whole revolution is off. And it gets to something deeply problematic or, schismatic, I guess, in the relationship between African Americans and the society. On the one hand, the society tells you, assume these virtues, follow these values, be a certain way, conduct yourself a certain way, a suite of values that we might collectively call middle-class values. But you often have found throughout history that it is the very assumption of those values that actually threaten the larger population the most. So if you study the history of the race riots, for instance, it's pretty amazing, but very often the first place these folks go to burn down are middle-class communities. They go to the business district right away. That's the threat. In the postbellum period of early Reconstruction and into Redemption, first thing they burned down were the sites of improvement, the church and the schools. And so it's almost as if those are the things, the very idea of uplift are the things that are most threatening. And I think you saw that during the 8 years of the Obama administration. I think on the one hand, the president was in many ways like a kind of ambassador, from Black America to the larger country. Here you have, this tall, attractive, Ivy League trained, first Black editor of the Harvard Law Review with his Ivy League educated, beautiful wife, 2 beautiful children, dog named Bo. I mean, it looks like, and brilliant, right? And brilliant. It looks like a Christmas card, an invitation from us to them. This is the best we got. Here it is. This is us. And they're like, no. No, we don't believe you. We don't believe any of this. The opposition party is like, in fact, half of us, majority of us, or plurality of us, depending on where you're taking the poll, we don't even believe you're American. We believe, we don't even believe you're a legitimate president. And then when the president was forced to pull out the birth certificate, it went to, well, let me see your transcripts. Like, something about this story is off. And it harkens back to that whole idea. If the moment we accept you, the moment you're legitimate, the moment you're a soldier, the revolution is over. Our entire theory is off. And so you can see these kind of echoes across, the history of something that happened, 150 years ago.
So when you were working on this book, did you see the train coming before it arrived in the station? Did you see that we were entering the period that we are now in?
I should have. I was too terrified. You know what I saw? There's a blog post that I wrote about 2010, and it was when I was really getting into the Civil War, 2009, 2010. I was still very excited about the prospect of a Black presidency, and I was feeling very enthusiastic. And I guess it was 2009, because this would have been before Henry Louis Gates was arrested. And I was beginning to, get into the war, and it was clear that, I began to see the full horror of the war. I began to see the full horror of slavery, and I'm blogging for every, the audience. And I said, listen, my great fear in looking at this is that maybe it demonstrates that this moment that we're in, this moment of optimism, is actually a respite, and what we see throughout, like the past is actually the norm, that we might head back to this. And that was a little simplistic, and I think the essays in this book track this. The further we got along, the more I could see the gravity of history. The more I felt that the society at large was underestimating. Birtherism, for instance, which I talk about all the time. I mean, people would laugh at it and dismiss it. It was frightening to me. It was really, really scary.
It was seen as a sideshow, almost.
It was seen as a sideshow. It's something these crazy people believe. It certainly was not seen as something that could launch a winning presidential campaign. No one thought that, but that turned out to be true. I think,
Is that the fault of the media? I mean, we're two journalists, so we're having this conversation, but...
I actually think it's the fault of the American people. I don't, know. It's funny because I actually had this conversation with the president, and his argument was, it's the media. There's a right-wing echo chamber that tells people things, that spits things out to people that, I guess he would say reinforces their worst beliefs. I think that's true, but I think that there is a disturbing percentage of people in this country that want to believe those things, that need to believe those things. Listen, if I pull out, the birth certificate and you still believe, then what's going on now? It's not an information problem anymore. Something else is happening. And we have to lean into that.
We do.
I mean, we do. I mean, I know some people would quibble about this, but we do, maybe I would quibble about it. I'm going to say it anyway. I mean, we do live in an approximation of a democracy. And the only reason why I'm saying that is because, the popular vote went one way and the presidency went another. But we live in a republic. Let's say that. We definitely live in a republic. And so I think if you're going to accept that and you're going to brag about that, well, some responsibility falls on the people then, in that case.
There was a period where you were obsessed with the Civil War. Like every time to have a conversation with you was to learn about this new fact that you had discovered or this new battlefield. And in fact, when you wrote the previous book, you were originally going to write about the Civil War. And remember, we were going back and forth. No, you should write the Frederick Douglass. No, you should write about Frederick Douglass. And you were planning to write about that. Will you return to that? Is that something? Do you feel the need to dip back into that?
I
and
do.
Again,
I do.
Talk about sort of history and the pluperfect.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's actually all through this book, even if it's not, even if there's only one specific essay dealing with it. I actually think it haunts that book. I think the impact and the weight of the Civil War is deeply, deeply underestimated. 700, somewhere in the neighborhood of 700, 800,000 Americans died in the Civil War. I'm only, saying 7 to 8 because the casualty, there are these new counts on the casualty rate, and it keeps changing. That is more than all Americans who have died in all wars combined. It dwarfs World War II, it dwarfs World War I, it dwarfs Vietnam, it obviously dwarfs the American Revolution. It was a huge amount of people, somewhere around 20% of all military-age Southern white men died in the Civil War. It was just complete and total carnage. It was also the evaporation of the largest collection of wealth in the country, period, by far. All other wealth combined, all banks, all nation factories, all shipyards put together were worth less than the 4 million enslaved African Americans in this country. That had to have a huge impact, and it did have a huge impact. There's a reason why, even at this late date, that you have a statue of Robert E. Lee, who led an army into Maryland and Antietam, and then led an army into Pennsylvania in Gettysburg, and on every trip led an army which kidnapped free black people and dragged them back into slavery. That should be the first line when you hear Robert E. Lee, but people don't say that. There's a reason why at this late date people are still defending that statue. They say, what are you defending? And they say heritage. Heritage of what, though? What specifically? What was actually being fought for? And you never get a straight answer. I was looking at this video today, and they're renaming a school. School used to be named Robert E. Lee. These young girls, these young high school girls, and they are crying, bawling about the prospect of their school being renamed from Robert E. I don't even know if they know what they're crying for. But I know. And I think a lot of black people know, too. And I suspect somewhere deep, in the back of their brains, their parents know. The weight that this thing exerts, up into today is just tremendous, and I don't think it gets enough credit. I do think I'll return to it. I do. I'm not sure in what form, but I do think I'll return to it.
When you write, journalists are often insecure overachievers. It's a fact. You talk a lot about that your confidence comes from the work that you do, that you're prepared, you throw yourself into that. But in your very first book, you also talk about your insecurities. And then you return to that in your last book. How do your insecurities inform your work? How do you make them work for you?
I think I'm pretty manic about chasing down every little angle in an argument. I think I am aware that I'm making arguments that are not accepted within the mainstream. If you make basic mainstream arguments, you have a right to sloppiness. I mean, you just do. If you want to argue that black people are in the condition that they're in because, say, black-on-black violence, you don't have to be particularly complicated. There's no weight put on. You can say that in any op-ed page, up one side, down the other. Things that verify the preconceptions that are already present within the society, you can just be sloppy. If you want to make a case for reparations, every I better be dotted, every T better be crossed. You need to be really, really, really tight. If you're going to make, the argument that mass incarceration in some sort of way is the continuation of violence against African-American families that extends back through slavery, through Jim Crow, there is some sort of line. Every I better be dotted and every T better be crossed. I think I'm really manic about making sure the logic is, where it should be. I get a tremendous amount of assistance from the fact-check department, specifically at The Atlantic, that, goes back after and makes sure, everything is in place as it should be. But because I know the arguments are so far outside the mainstream, it's really, really important that I not get caught, with some sort of, really, really big error.
So when journalists, you often know about the front-end process, the writing, the reporting, chasing a story and wrestling it to the ground. What most people don't know about are the back end of the process. I mean, you see the back end perhaps in the comment stream, which is like a rain of fists hailing down from the sky. But I know, because I know you, that there are things that happen when you publish stories, that people call you, that people who make policy, who shape policy, call you. You make them think about things in a different way. Are there one or two examples that you could share with us tonight?
You know what? Yeah. But I always wonder whether I'm actually changing any minds. I think But
if someone picks up the phone to call you, you made them think.
Yeah, okay, I will concede that. Probably the biggest example is, being in conversation on the record, off the record with the president. I mean, that's the most...
President Obama.
President Obama. I should be specific here. Trump has not
I'm trying
called.
to imagine a conversation between the two of you, and that would be delicious. I would like to.
There's nothing to be said. I mean, and that's true. There's really, I don't even know if I would go. There's just nothing. I mean, for me, I'm talking about me specifically. Other reporters, have different missions and are positioned in a different way. But for me, there's really nothing to say. That probably was the biggest, and I think I had, especially on the first few occasions, a difficult time adjusting to the fact that I was actually there. I'm in my own head, and so I see myself as I am in the process, in my ratty, hoodie, maybe in my pajamas, at home, working on some big piece, and, if I'm truly in it, having not shaved, having not showered, just sort of like here, you know what I mean? And not really caring about anything else. And I'm not thinking about who's going to read it too much. So if you write something about the president, something a little sharp about the president, and then somebody from the president's office calls you and says, why don't you come down here and talk to the president about it? That's different.
You have shave for that.
Yeah, exactly. You got shave for that. You really should. But that's different. And I was just like a shock. I was like, what? What are you calling me for? You're supposed to be out saving the world. Like, what are you talking to me for? And that was the feeling. And I think also, as, those conversations evolved, and I knew that I was saying things that were way beyond the capacity of a president to actually do. The fact that, I continued to be called, that, I continued to be invited into that conversation was, well, I'm not supposed to say this, but, I said it was endearing. That's what I'll say.
When you say more about that, when you say endearing.
It's just not your expectation, and maybe this is just having low expectations, that politicians are going to be particularly curious about things that are beyond the immediately doable. And I think my journalism works in the realm of things that are generally way, way beyond the immediate doable. I see my role as not to write as though, I'm a Senate aide trying to get policy passed. I'm supposed to say things that hopefully adjust the entire process, that adjust the entire context, that shape what, is actually possible to pass. And I don't know. It was shocking to me, that people who were in, and not just the president, people that were in the president's office, that they actually cared, and actually, read that sort of thing. And so it was endearing that, he was actually curious about those things. That, when I went to do, the very last piece in the book, he actually had a long and thoughtful conversation about reparations. I don't think anybody ever expected anybody sitting in the White House to do that. And so I very much appreciated and admired his curiosity.
That speaks to who he is. He engages with people on a regular basis. And not to diminish that, but that's who he is. He likes to spar with people. He's intellectually curious. Did you also hear from people in the prison industrial complex, from teachers who were thinking about history in a different way, from police officers who read your story and said, I maybe need to think about this a little bit differently?
I heard from teachers all the time. I heard from people in the prisons all the time. I will never forget being on vacation in Miami, and I was with a friend, and I was in a moment where I guess I was like upset, or I was thinking, God, I need to do something different. I have these thoughts sometimes. I need to go do something different. And we were, just sitting there, and a guy comes up, and he, recognized me, and he, began talking about some of the work. He was a Latino dude, and he was in a criminal justice program. He was, becoming a police officer. And he talked about how he had read, Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration. And we talked about that, and then he walked away. My buddy said, well, that's who you want reading it. That's why you have to, do this. That's exactly your ideal reader, because that's the sort of person that's going to be on the front lines in an actual confrontation. I got invited up to West Point, which was awesome. It was just absolutely, absolutely incredible. Some of the sharpest kids, you really ever want to be with. And one of the few educational institutions I was in where diversity was real. I think like their population might be like 15% African American. It's, because of the admission process. It's very, very different. A number of Asian students, it was like what you would dream America to actually be. It did. It looked like the actual country, and they were just so sharp, and they were just so inquiring. And so, the ability to interact with, folks, who are future military officers about, the country that they are protecting. And they had a Civil War memorial that had been built up there that I saw that morning. And it was, as far as I was concerned, not what it should be. And they had a motto, a cadet's pledge that they take, which basically says a cadet will never steal, lie, etc. But lie is a huge part of it, and if you witness a lie, you're supposed to say something about it. And I told him, I said, listen, I know that that's a part of, your basic pledge to each other, but what about, how do you apply that pledge to your broader institution? You have a monument here that is not honest about the war. How are you questioning that? Are you interrogating that? Are you thinking about, I understand it's your job to go off and protect the country, but are you thinking about the country that you're actually protecting? And the story that is telling. And they were, this was not like a confrontation. They were just really, really curious and inquiring. It was great.
I can't help but when you talk about your conversation with the cadets at West Point, I can't help but think about the controversy that we're enmeshed in right now over whether or not NFL players or other athletes should be allowed to take a knee without it being viewed as a gesture of disrespect to the American flag and the country as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's particularly inside an NFL changing its rules and Jerry Jones saying that he will bench anybody who doesn't take a knee. I think every single Dallas Cowboy has a responsibility to take a knee. I think and I've been meaning to write this, but I've been running around. I really need to write it because you listen. This is at this point, this is actually a labor question. There's a great 30 for 30 on right now. Actually, it's not that good. I'm sorry, it's not great. It's deeply problematic, in fact. But it shaped some things I'm about to say. But it's about the strike season in the late 80s, and no one remembers what the strike was for. The strike was for the right to free agency. Mm-hmm. The right to basically not have, someone restrict you in terms of where you could work. It's right to work, right to compete, as all workers should have. And, my politics don't allow for this. It took the story angle that it told was from the perspective of, as far as I'm concerned, the scabs that they brought in. And they made them into heroes, which was really hard for me to watch, because in fact what they were doing was they were serving ownership. And they were actually destroying, the ability of the workers to actually, organize and have some right to vend their labor and actually compete. The strike was ultimately broken. People paid a serious, serious price for that. Eventually, they got free agency. The players today stand on the backs of that struggle. They owe those folks to not allow. And listen, I was okay before where, maybe you feel like Colin Kaepernick does, or maybe you don't. You ain't got to kneel. I would never tell somebody, that they have to protest. But this has now become a labor issue. I have, and maybe, not rightfully, but when I see a white billionaire telling a majority black team, boy, if you do X, Y, and Z, and I know he didn't say boy, but that's what it sounded like to me. Listen, I can't stand. You got to have some respect for everybody that struggled on your behalf. And even if you ain't got respect for them, you really should have some respect for the young people who are literally in college beating each other's brains out right now for the opportunity to just work a job. I think, every day, and arguably every, NFL player, like, this should be a serious, I don't know where the union is on this, but that's obscene. It's obscene. If they let them do this, it will be repercussions felt for years after, because they ain't going to stop here.
It is a story that will be told eventually, probably in the halls of this building. It has become that large. It is that kind of moment. But as we talk about this, do we risk as a society forgetting why Colin Kaepernick took a knee in the first place?
We do. I struggle, though, because I wonder if that is not the fate of all, civil rights protests. I mean, certainly Martin Luther King has been completely co-opted. You have people quoting Martin Luther King to bash Colin Kaepernick. But I think something that should not be forgotten, that is not really getting much press attention, is if you go to Colin Kaepernick's website, this has not been co-opted. You'll see, and people forget this, he made a pledge. This is a man that's given up his livelihood, right? He made a pledge that he would give away $1 million over the course of the year to organizations that he thought, were doing good and progressive work in the community. He has kept that pledge. He's documented every organization he's given money to. If you go to his website, you can see what the money is going to, even within the organization. It's a stunning amount of transparency. And nobody's seeing that. Nobody's paying any attention to it. That has not been, co-opted. And so I really admire how, even as they pushed him out of the league, he's been able to be a force in folks' life, and actually, continue to be an activist.
I'm not an editor, but I think I just heard a column. I want to talk about your influences. You were a voracious reader. Not always, but at one point, you just filled your life, your home, your room, your bag, whenever you left the house, with books. Who are your influencers? Whose work most influences the work that you produce now?
Oh, my. Well, I mean, in fairness, when I was a child, I was a huge hip-hop fan, and that had a huge influence on me. I was, my first influences were all really pop culture stuff, a lot of comic books, a lot of hip-hop. As I got older, I mean, an obvious one is, James Baldwin, tremendous influence on me. The novelist E.L. Doctorow, a huge, huge influence on me. Doctorow had an ability to conjure history and make it alive. I don't know who he is, Red Ragtime, but it's just
it's a fantastic book.
Oh, my gosh. It's a wondrous, fantastic book. F. Scott Fitzgerald had a huge influence on me. And I learned from him something I learned from Baldwin, that you could write a book that is relatively brief and it can just be tremendous. It's probably my favorite novel. A number of journalists today have a huge influence on me. Elizabeth Colbert, who works over at the New Yorker, who I think does a lot of what I try to do, what I hope to do. She's a much, much better reporter, but has this ability to write and turn the reporting into literature in a beautiful way. I'm a huge language and sentence freak, and so Caitlin Flanagan at the New Yorker, even though our politics don't, I'm not at the New Yorker. Sorry, Bob. Forgive me. In fairness, she once wrote for the New Yorker at one point. At the Atlantic, at my magazine, even though, we have our disagreements about politics, I just think she's a wondrous, just beautiful, beautiful writer. I look to her a lot. Historians have a huge influence on me. James McPherson, with his great book, Battle Cry of Freedom. The historian Thavolia Glymph down at Duke. I could go on. Quite a lot.
What's the book you return to time and time again?
Gatsby.
Really?
Yeah, Gatsby.
Why? What do you look for and what do you get from it?
Oh, it's just, it has a, it has a kind of romance, but not the kind of romance that people think of as romance. It's not a happy, lovey-dovey story, but the imagery, it has a heart to it. It has a lushness to it. And then at the same time, it is ruthlessly efficient. I haven't read a book that's short, that pulls me in and invests me, right from go, right from page one. I'm there, and it was one of those books, much like Fire Next Time, where I sat and I read that book in one day. I just went, and I tried to read it again last time I read Gatsby was about 2 or 3 years ago. And you read things when you're young and you're not sure that they will hold up, and it's such a gratifying feeling to go back to something and say, wow, I was right. I read this when I was 19, and I thought it was brilliant, and I wasn't stupid. It wasn't, you know what I mean? It really is that good. It really, really is that brilliant. Readers then and readers now have so many better things to do besides read what you're writing. And you just really have this obligation to write with a kind of intensity and efficiency. Even if I'm writing at 20,000 words, it better be a good 20,000 words. You need to feel like, you're taken. And I just, I think that book is incredible. I also think as a African-American, it's a weirdly black story, because it's about this desire to, I promise I'm going to stop talking about Gatsby. I promise. I'm almost done. It's a story about a guy who is trying to, in many ways, adhere to these ideas of good Negro government. He's trying to present himself as, presentable, as respectable to society, and the effort to do that actually gets him killed, in the long term. And so it's a very, very relatable story, I think, for myself as an African American.
When you went through the litany of people who have influenced you, you mentioned a few women, but I didn't hear you mention African American women.
Well, yeah, there was one I mentioned, Thavolia Glymph, down at Duke. Who is big. Thavolia wrote this great book. It's the only footnote I have in Between the World and Me, and it's there for a reason. It's a book called Out of the House of Bondage, and it is about the brutality that was inflicted by white women on black women in the domestic sphere in the house. People always think about house slaves as, this sort of protected space. You didn't have it as bad as field slaves. And she was one of the people that really resurrected this notion that slavery is slavery. And there is, this notion that white women, and really it's not white women, it's about human beings. Because there's this notion that femininity makes you softer, that makes you more forgiving, that you won't be as harsh as men. And she shows in brutal detail how these women would turn to violence just as easily, and sometimes more easily, as their husbands. So that was just a tremendous book for me, because it showed there is no protected space. There is no softer slavery. There is no better slave. It's all slavery. It's all the possession of your body. It's a tremendous, tremendous book.
The reason I ask about the influence of the black female intellectual is because in literature, in journalism, in popular culture, there is a considerable emotional, intellectual energy trying to understand the interior lives of black men, and that doesn't always feel like a two-way street.
I wonder, Do you get that from Toni Morrison's novels? Like, do you feel like you get that? The interior exploration of African-American women. Do you feel like you get that from her novels?
I do. I do.
Yeah, I think like it was one of the...
And going back, I mean, Sula, The Bluest Eye.
Right, of course.
Most definitely.
Of
and
course.
more recently with even Home, which is principally about a male character.
Yeah.
It's about, the women that are all around him. And God Bless the Child, of course, was about.
I asked that question because, one of the things that I think happened with Between the World, I mean, I agree with you, it's not always a two-way street. You're always in the process of actually, doing the thing when you're writing it. And when the book came out, you have to understand, I had no expectation that book was going to become what it would become. I just wanted to get it done. I was afraid it wasn't going to actually be a book. I literally was, scared that I couldn't actually do this thing. And and this really takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, because it's one of the reasons why I don't want any part of, it's kind of prophetic, idealist, prophetic tradition. Like, it became this sort of, okay, this is the book of our generation. But I don't know that any book can carry that, And one of the huge things about it was, okay, you're exploring this perspective in this letter to your son, and so it's a very masculine depiction of black life, which it is. But I wish there were more books like it. It can't carry the weight of an entire community. It can only carry the weight. It really can't even carry the weight of African-American men, because I have, a very, very particular experience. I can only, speak, from my perspective. And it has not been comfortable to have the expectation that, you will speak from all perspectives within the community.
You feel that that's laid on your shoulders?
All the time. I have no doubt about it. I see it all the time. I see it all the time. And I'm not mad about it, because I don't think the origin of it is the people that are laying it on my shoulders. I think the origin of it is the fact that we have not had equal access to all things. We have not had, the ability to tell our stories, in the variety and in the depth that, other communities get to tell them. I am lucky to have an African-American editor. He's an African-American man.
Let's say his name, Chris Jackson.
Chris Jackson. He's a brilliant, brilliant editor. I don't know how many other people in publishing there are like him. You probably could count them on one hand. And the editor is very much the gateway, the advocate, for your project. So I don't enjoy it, but I understand, why it's there. I have a very, very particular experience. I come out of the 1980s. I come out of, a period in a community where, most of my friends did not have fathers. I went to a HBCU, which is a very specific thing. And so there are going to be themes that are really, really striking and interesting to me that will not cover the entirety of the African-American experience.
I'm going to take questions from the audience. I have a few here, but before we do, can we turn to comic books for a moment?
Yes.
You grew up reading, loving comic books. You're now writing the Black Panther series. And for someone, I think you just said that you love...
I hope every one of you go to your comic store every month. See, all of y'all are clapping. But I don't know that all of y'all are in that comic store every month buying that comic book. So I expect every one of you that are clapping to go to your comic book store. Thank you. That's what I'm talking about right there.
And when you do, you need to protect them with sheaths. And
right, you need to really get into it, man. Come on now. Come on.
But you talk about how you labor over sentences so that they have the right cadence, so they sound like jazz, and so they hit on the, that there's a graceful dismount at the end of the paragraph. But when you're writing comic books, the boom, the pow, it's just different. So tell me about the process of going from
You're
one
still
to the
trying
other.
to do it, though. Actually, it's harder in comics. You have so much less space. And you don't have a paragraph. You have 1-2 sentences. It's a lot more like poetry. And in that same sense, you still have to think a lot about, I read those scripts out loud to myself. Even though they're not meant to be read out loud in that sort of way, you still has to hit the ear in a particular way. And it is hard because you have so much less space. It's a serious challenge, but I love it. I adore doing it.
Is it challenging also because do the pictures always take the lead? Is it a dance
Pictures
where they
always take the lead. The pictures always take the lead. And when you write a script, and I had to learn this, the vast majority of your text, 80, 90%, is actually written to the artist. It's not what the character actually says. It's what's happening. So it's a very, very different process.
Do you have to tap into an inner 11-year-old to do this, or?
Yeah, I do, but that isn't hard. What's hard is seeing the world through images. That's hard, which is very, very different than you have to see it as a journalist.
Let's take some questions from the audience. How worried should we be about the FBI's new CONTELPRO angle with the creation
Very worried.
of
Very worried.
its new group that it's watching, tracking, the group that they've dubbed Black Identity Extremists?
You should be scared. Yeah, you should be deeply. The building is called the J. Edgar Hoover Building. I mean, that's the name. And I know, like, there's a rhetoric around this where the FBI says, well, it was bad old days, we don't do that. It's called the J. Edgar Hoover Building, man. That was not long ago. I mean, I speak about this very, very personally. I did and I talk about this in the book. The day I did my last interview with President Obama, I had to film an episode of Finding Your Roots. And they had my dad's FBI file right there. And in that file, there was some bad stuff in that file. Not that my dad had done, but things that, the FBI was trying to do. So I got a real direct contact to this. It is not a game. It's not fiction. The FBI, with the consent of President Kennedy and then President Johnson, dogged Martin Luther King until his dying day. That was Martin Luther King. This is not Malcolm X. This is Martin Luther King. This is, peaceful, nonviolent. They dogged him to the end, man. Wrote him letters to try to get him to kill himself. And so that's within the living memory. That's not a civil war. It's not 100. That's within their people alive. My dad, who actually experienced that, who can testify that. There's no reason why you should not be skeptical. You should be scared. You should be really, really scared.
So what is the avenue for pushing back against that? And the timeline is interesting because this effort started in the previous administration.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It started in 2016.
Boy, Jesus. It just gets worse. People say I'm pessimistic. You know what I mean? Like, Jesus Christ.
Or I should say, not within the previous administration, but before the changeover in government.
Yeah. And I get it. It's not like Obama's handed down the order saying, go do X, Y, and Z. I understand that. I understand the FBI is supposed to act independently. But still, I mean, you just, I don't know. I got asked last night to, work on a particular story of great importance, and I couldn't work on it because I had my own path. One of the frustrations, in addition, again, going back to this notion of, like, what a writer can do, there are so many stories out there waiting for young journalists, period, with the skills, with the abilities to go attack and tackle. Somebody should be following that up right now. The other thing, I'm going back to COINTELPRO, but you don't have to go back to COINTELPRO. In New York, up until, I believe, 2013, 2014, I can't remember the year it was shut down, but the NYPD had what it called a demographics unit, where it ran around and it spied on mosques. It didn't make a single case. Like, not a single lead came out of this effort. That's a real thing that actually, it's in the New York Times. It happened. This is not conspiracy theory. You should be afraid. If I were, the journalist right now who had the kind of time and wasn't chasing down, my own story, I would be on that. I would be on that. People should be watching. Interesting
also that the FBI closely monitored writers in the Renaissance movement, and writers out of Harlem and other parts of the country. And ironically, some of the most detailed files on their lives are due to the FBI monitoring, chronicled in a book called FBI's, EYES.
Well, just real quick, as soon as Trump won, all of my friends, we immediately went to Signal. All of my trackers, we immediately was like, okay, well, I guess we're not doing this through instant messenger anymore. That's done.
We have some.
Call me paranoid. I don't care. Call me, they spied on my dad, so I think I got it right.
We have wonderful questions. Let's go through some more. Your thoughts on the Fannie Lou Hamer quote, where they made their mistake is they made us walk behind them, and we saw everything they did.
That's a new quote. I'm sorry. Again, I'm not going to be the prophet here. I'm completely
raise your
unfamiliar
hand.
with that quote.
Who sent in this question? You're not going to own it because it's a fabulous question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I can't. I'm sorry. That's a fabulous, but I don't know the context, so I can't really give thoughts on it. I'm sorry.
Your thoughts on the notion, though, that
I'm not sure. Does that mean behind the men, and then we saw everything
I
they
think
did?
she meant
that's the illusion.
that people of color had to walk behind.
People of color had to walk behind white
society,
people?
and yes, and as a result, saw with great clarity everything they did. And therefore,
I would love to see that quote in context. I'm sorry. I can't stand up here and freestyle it. I'm sorry.
Okay. A question about the New York Times op-ed by Thomas Williams. I expected that we would get a question about this tonight, so here it is. What is your view of Williams' point about the excessive focus on race in your work? His quote is, Mr. Williams said, "We will all be doomed to stalk our separate paths if we continue to focus on this in the way that he says you're doing."
Well, I would love to focus on other things. I really would. I would love to. I would love to. I have a love for medieval history. I really do. I love reading about the 30 Years' War. It's incredible. It's fascinating. I would love to spend more time studying French. I started learning to swim this year. I wish I could do that 5 days a week. When I first became a writer, I started off in poetry. I wish I could go back to that and spend more time with poetry. I would love to go back to school and study economics. There are a host of things I would rather be doing than talking about this. And I think every African American, most African Americans, maybe not every, because I can't speak for Thomas, but I think most African Americans can identify, with the notion of really not wanting to deal with this. But just last Friday, was it, BuzzFeed published a story that showed how this, allegedly branded alt-right was basically conspiring with white supremacists and neo-Nazis to rebrand themselves, to launder themselves. And the head of BuzzFeed was an official in the White House. On Saturday, Richard Spencer and a band of white supremacists returned to Charlottesville. We have, a situation where the owner of the Dallas Cowboys is telling folks that if they exercise their right, which, by the way, was supposed to be a compromise. It was a compromise. People forget that. Colin Kaepernick came up with that after talking to somebody, to a military veteran, trying to find a more respectful way. Not even that, will be tolerated. We don't know when the next video is going to come out of, some police officer executing somebody. What Thomas wants me to do is turn my back on my community. He wants me to turn my back on the struggle. He wants me to turn my back on the very thing that made it possible for me to be here talking to you guys tonight. Now, Thomas might feel like he has that option. And frankly, it's interesting because if you look at his work, he don't actually exercise that option. He writes about race all the time himself. He just does it from a different perspective. I don't have that option. I just don't. This is where I live. This is where the war is. This is my home. This is my family. This is what I do. This is my community. Do you
find it interesting? I run something called the Race Card Project, so I'm subject to this criticism as well. And do you find it curious when people tell you to stop talking about race that they don't have to listen?
Yeah, and I find it curious, again, from people who talk about race all the time themselves. They don't want you to stop talking about race. They want you to talk about race from their perspective. They want it from their perspective. And I'm not urging you to go and read anybody's work, but let's just say it's a very different perspective.
It's always good to actually read several perspectives.
You said what?
But it's always good to read things from several perspectives. And on that note, a question. HBO is still moving forward. Excuse me. That was not.
It's because you tried to say Confederate? Is that what?
It's allergies. I promise it's allergies.
So what?
HBO is still moving. Excuse me. HBO is still moving forward with their plans to air the show Confederate. The writer wants to know how people should protest, if they should protest, or otherwise rebel against the show and the network. Your thoughts on that?
I'm the wrong person to ask that. You know, I'm not really an activist. I'm not in the mode of. I don't think that shows should exist. I think I think it's sad that it exists. I think it reflects again, you know, what I was talking about, a deep misapprehension of what the Civil War was. This is not a show about the South winning. The majority of the people in the South, if you include the enslaved black folks, if you include the Unionists, if you include folks who had no say in the political process at all, would not have been for secession. It certainly is not about South Carolina winning. Most people in South Carolina were black. They don't feel like they lost the Civil War. That very perspective. See, this is about the white South losing. This is a story in which the white South wins. I don't know what to tell people that are interested in seeing that story, given that that story has been told several times ad hoc. It's not a new idea. You know, it's been told in fiction. It's actually been told in mockumentaries. It's been told. There are people who would argue that the white South won anyway. That this is not, in fact, science fiction. But, you know, I'm a writer, so it's not really my perspective to, you know, say, you know, to go out and protest. What my job is to continue my fight, to write the stories that I think should exist, to tell the stories that I think should exist. If, you know, you feel like, you know, you want to organize a boycott, you know, et cetera, you know, I'm totally with that. I think that's a great idea. But it's not the position in which I sit. You know, so it's hard for me to advise, you know, activists on what they should do.
When you were spending a lot of time studying the Civil War, at one point you had said to me that it would be interesting to actually go back and talk to a Confederate soldier, to get inside their head. Not that I'm comparing people today with Confederate soldiers necessarily, but do you have any desire or impetus to go and speak to people who are carrying tiki torches in Charlottesville?
Nah. I think I know.
Okay.
And maybe that's dangerous, maybe that's wrong, but there are a number of journalists doing that work. There are a number, you know, of journalists, some of it good, some of it not so good, you know, who are doing that work. And I think I know. I think I know what this is.
How does Black America move beyond the Democratic Party to a legitimate independent third party, not beholden to corporate interests? This is another question from the audience.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, you're in a very, very difficult position. I mean, you have a country that's organized, you know, around a two-party system. It would be different if we were living in I'm losing all my words, a parliamentary democracy, where, you know, you have different parties that, you know, lobby. I wish we were, you know, living in that world where folks have to have representation. There has not been a national, you know, third-party successful, you know, candidacy, one that, you know, even, you know, really claimed credit, probably in 20 years, and that hasn't been one that was actually successful since I don't know when. I'm only struggling with that because I don't like, you know, early, you know, in the founders' history, I don't know if, like, you know, say some of those nascent parties, Whig Party, Democrat, Republican Party, would be considered third parties, et cetera. The point is, you're very much in a two-party system. I guess if I were trying to do that, I probably would start building at the local level. I probably would not focus so much on the presidency. I probably would try to begin, because I think people underestimate the importance of local office. You know, your city council person, your legislature. So I probably would start there, but again, you know, I'm a writer. I'm not a political strategist.
So the question presumed that the African American community needs to move past the Democratic Party. That was a presupposition there. I just want to throw in a question about voting. I know that that was one of the things that you had wanted to write about, didn't quite get to it in the way that you wanted to. Why is it so difficult to get African Americans to register to vote and to vote in large numbers?
Yeah, I think it's hard.
In not just presidential election, but in off-year elections,
right,
and in local elections. You just talked about the importance of local elections.
Right. Well, it would be wrong of me not to say this. I can't, it was just a local election in New York. I didn't vote. That was deeply, deeply irresponsible, but I didn't. I think one of the things that happens is like...
Why didn't you vote?
Why didn't I vote? I didn't do the homework to find out, like, when the election was. Like, I voted, obviously, yeah, I know. I just didn't, I didn't, and I don't know, I don't have a good excuse.
Is there a good excuse for not voting? I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to
No,
fuss
there are
at
plenty
you,
of
but-
reasons, but there's no good excuse. No, there's no good excuse. There are plenty of reasons for why. You can look at, other societies and how, but I don't want to do that. You know what I mean? I didn't vote. You know what I mean? And so there's no good excuse for not voting. So I probably shouldn't answer that question, to be honest with you. I'm not going to stand in judgment of anybody else.
We're going to take that offline. Do you believe that journalists have a right to speak on their own political views? We have 2 short questions before we close. Do you believe that journalists have a right to speak on their own political views? This is a question that is speaking to Jemele Hill and her current situation with ESPN, her 2-week suspension, at the risk of losing their jobs, speaking their political views at the risk of losing their jobs. Now, different news organizations have codes of conduct, standards of moral turpitude, but this is a broader question about whether people should be able to.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know the intricacies of, obviously, I agree with what Jamel said. I don't know the intricacies of, ESPN's code of conduct in terms of social media. I think, and this is just, oh boy. I think people need to remember, because it works both ways, that, freedom of speech is freedom from censorship by the government. It's not freedom from censorship from, corporate. I work for The Atlantic. I can't tweet everything I believe.
But you are an opinion journalist, so you have more latitude than
but
many journalists
I'm telling
do.
you, I cannot tweet everything I believe. And you know what? Nor should I, by the way. Nor should I. Now, I might have a belief. I have the latitude to construct a piece around that belief, but there are things that are appropriate for coffee, in the morning with my wife. There are things that are appropriate for me even to say to Bob that I should not, even if I were working for The Atlantic, I should not do it, that ultimately aren't good for me as a journalist. I actually have some degree of concern about this, like, all right, so I'm here, so I'm going to say it. I think that there are a lot of things that journalists in general, period, say over Twitter that they really should think about putting into their work. I don't think they should stop saying it. I think they should do their job. I think they should, if that's a thought and it's really that important that it has to be expressed in the world, well, buttress it with the kind of facts, reporting, et cetera, that really, should be there. I don't want to criticize, Jamel. I think, and I definitely don't want to criticize her, in light of what she was responding to, which I think is absurd. I understand the impulse completely. I support her. I think she's beautiful. I think she's brilliant, beautiful mind. I'm not, making some sort of assessment here, but I think I love her show. You know what I mean? I love what she does. I love what her and Mike do. I think for myself, when I get that impulse, I ask myself, why am I trying to say this? Why do I want to say this to the world? It don't mean that I'm always perfect. But why am I trying to tell the world this? And if it's such a valid opinion, nobody ever won an argument on Twitter, ever. If it's such a valid opinion, why not do the work, to make that opinion something that somebody can sit with, think about, be haunted by, disturbed by, bothered by? Why? Why do I have the need necessarily to tweet it out?
Is that why you are less active on Twitter than you used to be?
Yeah, that's exactly why. I think when I had a lower profile, it was much easier, but as my profile, really started to rise, it became clear that I had to watch what I said. I just did. And again, nobody, I haven't had a conversation, with anybody, to be clear, at The Atlantic about that. Nobody said to me, your tweeting is really a problem. That has not happened to me. But I have watched other writers, some of whom I agree with, on Twitter, and I cover my mouth looking at them. You know, it's not even that I disagree with him. I just think...
You and I shared a friend that used to like send out emails, step away from the keyboard.
Yeah, I know, seriously.
This is the last question, and it's appropriate because it gives me a chance to hold up the book that you're all going to read. The questioner wants to know, can you talk about the art on the inside cover of the book and what inspired you to include it? And if you have the book in your possession, you can, wonderful opportunity to open it to the inside page. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this.
It's good, because again, this allows us to conclude where we started. Once again, these are reasons why I assume the person likes the art. This is one of the reasons why you should not position yourself as an expert on anything. I didn't want that art in my book at all. I was like, this is horrible. That's what I thought. I mean, obviously, I was wrong. I just want, I'm not trying to insult the artist. I don't know everything clearly, but in fact, originally it was presented, the idea was for it to be the cover. And I was like, no, I don't want this cover at all. No, this is not close to anything I'm trying to do. Michelle Obama's head is too big. That don't look like Bill Cosby. So what are we doing here, man? Come on. But my editor, Chris, really, really loved that art. And they said, okay, Ta-Nehisi, fine, it's not the cover. Can we, put it on the inside as end papers? And I was like, really? Do we have to? And he said, listen, we don't have to if you don't want to. I said, okay, you clearly are very taken by this. Let's go ahead and do it. And people love it. I've had so many people talk to me about my dad, about the art on the inside, how it makes it, how the end papers make it look like a finished product. So I don't know. I clearly did not know. So it's a dangerous thing to become, too in love with your own opinions and your own voice. You got to watch yourself. Be careful.
What'd your dad say about it?
He said he loved it.
No, but what particularly did he like about it?
Oh, I don't actually remember, but I know he really loved the art. He said, I think he thought like it felt like it made it like a really finished thing. He liked it a lot.
Well, I agree with you. You were wrong.
Wouldn't be the first time.
It was right to include
Not
it.
even on this panel would it be the first time.
It's beautiful. The book is powerful. I hope you all dig into it tonight as soon as you get home. Ta-Nehisi, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
To the museum for having us.
Thank you.
It has been a wonderful evening.
Thank you.